This is Chad Jadis, and you're listening to The Art of Suffering. Our mess becomes God's message. In St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, he writes, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to ransom those under the law, so that we might receive adoption. And as proof that you are children, God sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child, and if a child, then also an heir through God. Through the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the sacrament of baptism, which flowed from his pierced side on Calvary, through the working of the Holy Spirit, you and I become adopted sons and daughters of God in our infusion into the mystical body of Christ on earth, the Catholic Church. Since the landmark Supreme Court case in 1973 of Roe v. Wade, there have been nearly 50 million abortions done in the United States alone. An unexpected or now often labeled unwanted pregnancy, in a secular sense, is defined as a health issue that can be treated by a physician under the pseudonym of reproductive rights. In doing some preliminary research for this episode, I found an article printed in 2019 from a publication called The Atlantic titled, "Why So Many Women Choose Abortion Over Adoption," with the subtitle, "Some American women see giving up their babies as more emotionally painful than terminating a pregnancy." Well, this just affirms something that is so prevalent in so many stories shared by those women who claim they have no regret for their abortion. The central focus in the situation is not the person who came into being because of a biological act, but rather the other person who chose to engage in that act that is naturally ordered toward the procreation of another person. This shameless assertion of self-interest at the thoughtless disregard for other has become so common in modern society that to point it out while questioning the moral integrity behind the person who made the decision will quickly let its critic be labeled as judgmental and lacking in compassion. This individualistic and utilitarian philosophy has slowly been ingrained as the norm in the current culture that dominates the 21st century United States. In our exchange of true freedom for unlimited license, we have forgotten what it means to be human and ignored the most prolific act in human history. Or I should say the most prolific intervention in human history, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, where God became man so that men could participate in the divine life of God. A true historical event that dramatically revealed that what we do doesn't define who we are. Composite beings of both body and soul that have an infinite value and are destined for eternal union with God. Look, we're not citizens of any country, state, or party, so much as in our baptism, we become citizens of heaven and members of God's universal and eternal family. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report that among never married women, about 9% chose adoption before the year 1973, when Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. By the mid-1980s, that figure dropped from 9% to 2%. And it was less than 1% by 2002. The last year, the CDC actually captured data about those statistics. And in 2014, only 18,000 children under the age of 2 were placed with adoption agencies and offered to be adopted. By comparison, there are about 1 million abortions annually in this country. The story you're about to hear today has many similar circumstances to the situations I just mentioned, but a completely different outcome. My guest today is an amazing woman who, much like the Blessed Mother, found herself as a young teenage girl in an unexpected pregnancy in a culturally hostile society that viewed it much differently than she did. Fran Hampton is a 61-year-old retired registered nurse. She's the mother of 4 beautiful children. She's a loving wife and an avid fitness enthusiast as well as a tennis player. And she continues today on her own faith journey and is striving for holiness in her role as a mother and wife to be both an example and catalyst for God that brings her immediate family closer to union with him. Fran, I'm so glad that you're here today, and thanks for being here on the podcast. I mean, I remember when you and I met in a very, very informal way in the chapel at St. Thomas More when my son Eli was born. We were praying there together, and, I can't believe it's already 12 years later, and Eli is going to be going to the 5th grade. And, my oldest son, by the time this thing comes out, it'll be about 6 months into that journey where he's actually now a freshman in high school. So please pray for me. And, I think back when I was reading about what you shared in the Face magazine article that you emailed me before this interview, and you talk about how you were pregnant in high school in 1974, not long after Roe versus Wade had been legalized, and you were a sophomore at a school in Baton Rouge, and you discovered you were pregnant. And instead of having an abortion, there was a great priest there, a man named Father Collins, who came into your life and kind of directed you toward a home where you could go after you'd been pregnant and share your child with the world through adoption. So welcome to the program, and tell us a little bit about that, what that was like in that home when you went there after being pregnant and were waiting for your son to be born. And once he was born, what happened next?
Oh, that was very interesting. Before it's a very old building on Magazine Street, and it first was a place for orphanage. It was an orphanage, and that was in the early 40s and 50s, I guess. And then it became a place for unwed mothers. It had nuns there that ran the place, and then it had counselors there that you would meet with and talk with. And then it had rooms for the unwed mothers to stay in, and there was two to a room. And above on the third floor were the babies that were placed there after they were born to go to an adoption agency or stay there as an orphanage. As an orphan. So you'd hear those babies crying. That was very difficult during this time. Like, I was there for 8 weeks, and it was very difficult to hear that and be pregnant knowing that you're giving your baby up for adoption. So some of the women, after they delivered, would end up keeping their child. It was difficult, for sure.
Well, I can imagine being an expectant mom at that time. And you said you were only there about 8 weeks. So that means like for
You're right.
the first couple of trimesters of the pregnancy, you were home, or
I was in
you were still at
school.
school, because people really couldn't tell. I remember
Right.
reading that in the article
Yes.
from the Face magazine, that people couldn't really tell you were pregnant. So it was really
Yeah.
kind of hard to notice
Right.
anything. So you only
Right.
spent a very small amount of time there right before the baby was born.
Right. Right.
There was
Right.
one thing that was mentioned about a young person there who had been abused. The article mentioned how you felt very grateful because you
It
had a lot
did.
of loving people around you, but there were some people there who were in completely
Right.
different situations. I mean, you got pregnant at 16 or 15 years old, right after Roe versus Wade was introduced.
Hmm.
You have this Catholic priest that comes and helps you and your family, and the church kind of ushers you into this place after your family's been very secretive about it, not getting it out. You get there and you find out. I remember reading it, it threw me back, and I was curious to know more about this young lady, or someone there had
Hmm.
been raped and they were carrying a child.
Right. Right. She was 11.
Oh my goodness.
Oh no,
Oh wow. So
she was
she must have
11.
been like a victim of like abuse. I'm assuming.
Yes, yes. She didn't, I don't recall her having much family. She would look at me as a mother figure, and I was only 3 years, 4 years older than her. And she was raped. There were women in there that really didn't have much respect, or they didn't really care about the child they were carrying. They would like smoke pot. They would find ways to get out and do stuff like that. And just, I was really on the straight and narrow and got very close to Sister Grace during that time. But there were some people that just really didn't, and they were older than me. They were like 19 or 20, and they were just like, oh, I'm pregnant, but whatever. I'm going to give it up for adoption. I don't really care. And it really was, I was very fortunate that I was very strong and did not follow that path, and chose to take good care of myself so I could deliver a healthy baby that someone else would raise.
No, and one of the most beautiful things I read and I know that I've heard you kind of share this verbally before, was that my understanding is one of the stipulations for the adoption process that you entered into is that you weren't allowed to hold your baby. after they were
Right.
born. Otherwise, it would forfeit the adoption. But as I was reading through the article, it says that you chose to go ahead and hold him anyway.
Hmm.
And I think what was so selfless and so beautiful was that you said, you loved him enough to let him go at that point in your life so he could have a better life at that time, one that you probably couldn't give him at the time. But you said, I love you. And that, I think you whispered in his ear, I love you. And that one day you have to come back to me, which is really
Right.
kind of the beautiful part of this whole story when it comes
Hmm.
full circle at the end.
Right.
But
Right.
can you maybe
Right.
talk about what was going on inside your mind and your heart that moment when you were holding him for the first time?
Well, I remember I was in labor for 12 hours and they didn't have anything to give you during that time. So, after I delivered him at the 5 minutes before midnight on Mardi Gras Day in New Orleans, I was a bit exhausted. But the next day, and my mother was there and Mike was there, and then they had left to go back to Baton Rouge because they couldn't stay around or whatever. You couldn't have anybody there. And the nurse came in, and I remember being very tearful. And she said, "What is it? What?" And I said, "I just feel like I need to hold him. I know it does the null and void for the adoption, but I'm not saying that I'm not going to give him up for adoption. I just need to hold him." And she brought him into me. And we had that brief time together. It may have been 15 or 20 minutes. And I knew that that would null and void. But when I did get back to Baton Rouge, we met with him again at the Catholic Life Center, Mike and I. And you have to remember that Mike really wanted to get married and really wanted me to keep the child. And that's when we had met at the Catholic Life Center with Stephen in the room, and we had to decide what we were going to do. And that's when the final decision was made.
And did Mike, your high school sweetheart, who you eventually, I guess, didn't marry, but you
Yeah,
guys had this child together? Because I read later on in the article you shared with me in an email from Face Magazine, I think he went off and served in the military for a while. But
right, right.
did he hold your son as well, or was that just you before you guys gave him up for adoption?
Not at the hospital, but he did hold him at the Catholic Life Center.
Listen,
Yeah, he
okay.
was a very, very nice guy and a very, we even dated a year after I had Stephen. He was in and out of the military, and then, I had graduated high school and went on. Um, I, I broke his heart, and his path in life went a different way than mine, and it wasn't as good. And, I feel very bad about that, but, you know, life goes on.
Life happens, I mean, there's some things in life
Hmm.
that we can't control. And,
Right.
I'm thinking about this is a huge cross for a 16-year-old child to carry, but you embraced it
Hmm.
well beyond your years. And you talked a little bit about Father Collins, who's the priest that helped you get into St. Vincent de Paul,
Hmm.
housing in homes for helping women with unexpected pregnancy, a Catholic home for that. But there was another sister, you just a nun. You mentioned her briefly. Let's maybe take a step back and her name was. You said her name was Sister Grace.
Sister
So
Grace.
how was she somebody who helped you carry that cross? You commented in the questions I gave you that she was very inspiring to you, and I was wondering what it was about her in that 8 weeks you were there prior to the birth of your son that made her such an inspiration to you as a
Yeah.
Catholic nun.
Well, I did go to Catholic school from kindergarten through 8th grade, and then I went to public school. So I was around a lot of nuns growing up,
Mhm.
and back then in the 60s, nuns were very rigid and strict, and I was kind of scared of them. Well, then when I met Sister Grace over at the Unwed at St. Vincent's, she was just bubbly, and she just had a lot of positivity about her, and she was always happy. And we did a lot of game playing and stuff, and she put me in a little school to teach reading to some small kids. I was beyond my years, I guess, back then, because she had a lot of faith in me um, to help her out in these areas. And we did a lot of arts, crafts, and I was very creative and stuff. And so we did a lot of things together. And she was just like my best friend there. And it was a whole different look on what a nun was as opposed to what I experienced back when I was in grade school.
So she was very personable.
Personable and friendly and very positive, very positive.
Well, it's always nice when you're walking in something like that to be able to journey with somebody who is a prayerful person and is there to be compassionate, which is to suffer with you in the middle of that and
Hmm.
to make you feel like through God's grace you can do just about anything
Right, right,
if you just trust in Him, right? No matter how
right.
difficult it is.
Hmm.
Now, your son, you named him Stephen, the one you gave up for adoption.
I actually named him Michael Francis.
Michael. Oh, that's right. That's right.
So
Okay. Okay. That's right.
he was
Michael.
named after Mike and me. Mike
Okay.
and
Oh, yeah,
me.
that makes sense. Yeah, Mike. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I got you. I got you. I got you. That's right.
So
That's right.
I gave him a bit of me and Mike
Okay.
on on that birth certificate that he has now. His adopted parents named him Stephen Christopher.
Oh, okay. So you named
Hmm.
him after you and your high school sweetheart, and his adopted parents gave him the name Stephen. Okay. I was a little.
Correct.
Okay. That's what makes sense. Okay. So he was born first, and then later on, after you broke up with your high school sweetheart, you actually went on and met your current husband, who you've been married to for a very long time, and
Very long
who's
time.
yes, you have 3 children with him. And I
Hmm.
remember teaching at St. Thomas More when a lot of them were there at the time when I
Hmm.
was a teacher there,
Hmm.
and when you and I were praying together. Um,
Uh-huh.
Post your first son's birth, um, after you met your current husband, until the time you had your other children, and you were carrying this around inside. You talked about in the article. I thought it was really awesome because it kind of personifies the kind of marriage you have with your husband now. How supportive he was of you after
Hmm.
you were carrying that around. Could you maybe talk about that dynamic between you and your husband Mark now?
Mark. Yeah, he always let's see, Mark and I will be married 32 years in September, but we've been together for 36. And I knew him. He's older than me, about 5 years, and I knew of him because he was a big basketball star and stuff or whatever. But anyway, when we got together, I think I met him during the time I was in nursing school. He wasn't in the medical field, but he knew some of the doctors that I knew and whatever. And I had previously been dating another guy who was a very good friend of mine. He was a big support too, was Bobby. I think it was in the article. He owned the dry cleaners and stuff. And Bobby and I go back. And the reason why I'm telling you this now, because it leads up to Mark, since we were 12 and we were very, very close. And when I did come back after having Stephen, 2 weeks later, Bobby, he was like, "Where have you been and what's going on?" And that I broke down and I did tell him what had happened. And he kept my secret forever, and we were very, very close. We ended up dating for a while as well, and then I did meet Mark, and Mark and I dated for about a year, and he said something to the fact that isn't there something in your past that you know maybe you should tell me about it or something like that. And I said, well, how do you know anything about my past? He said, I don't know, I just have a feeling or whatever. So like I said, rumors would happen. I never talked to anybody about it except for Bobby, really. And so I told him, and he said, he's like, well, that's cool, you did the right thing. And he was very supportive. And then when we got married, he would always tell me, I think you should find him. I think you should look him up. I think you should, And I was I was in a turmoil about all that. You said something in the article that you sent me about how I felt between the time Stephen was born and when I had Blake.
Yes.
Um, and that was a very
Blake's
tough
your
time.
firstborn, right?
Right, right.
With Mark. Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I mean,
with Mark.
with Mark, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, uh, you know, I would always think about Stephen like on his birthday or Christmas or Easter, just like, what is he doing? I hope he's happy. I hope he's not dead. I hope he's not a drug addict and, just different things. So I would pray for him. And then I found myself, and Blake will tell me this, that, he says this, I found myself protecting Blake a lot because he was my only son. And, Mark built this big business and everything, and him and Blake were close. Yet Blake, was a good athlete and did a lot of stuff, and I didn't. I came from all girls, so I didn't know how to guide him. And he was supposed to be on this basketball team and do the, whatever. But so I found myself really uh, overprotecting him, like because I had such a guilt over Stephen. And Blake would tell me sometimes, like when he was 16, I remember this one incident, and it will still stick in my head. And it was such a, oh, I don't even know how to explain it. It was so difficult. Blake, as you know, he played quarterback, and he ended up getting mono and got sick in his 10th year. And it was him and Mikey and Matt Vincent, and the coaches came up to Blake and said, "Look, we want you to go to wide receiver because we think you'd really do well there." And this was when he was going into his 11th grade, I guess. And Mark told him, "Don't go, don't 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 change your position because Mikey's probably going to get hurt." And because he runs with the ball or whatever. So, like I said, I don't know anything about this. And Blake said, "Dad, I won't get on the field if I don't change my position." So he changed to wide receiver. And the first game, he played wide receiver, and Mikey got hurt. I don't know if you remember that.
I actually, yeah, and just for the audience, a point of reference for the audience who's listening to this, before I got into being a director of catechesis, for a really long time, I was a coach at Cathedral Carmel, and I taught school there. And Mikey Matuk is a professional baseball player, or at least he was for some time now. And her oldest son with her husband Mark, they were in high school together at St. Thomas More at the same time I was there.
And they went to
teaching and coaching.
Fatima and Cathedral.
And they went. Yeah, there's this big rivalry, and we're both from Lafayette. And there's this big rivalry between these two K through 8 Catholic schools that used to be high schools, and they combined at some point to become St. Thomas More, and they were always rivals kind of growing up. I think he probably played quarterback at Fatima.
Blake was the big quarterback at Fatima, and Mikey was the quarterback
at Cathedral.
And it was different. Our athletic director had different things at Fatima he would do, and your athletic director had different things over there. So it's a big rivalry. And so Blake, after that game, we all meet for, food and stuff that everybody did after the game to tailgate. And Blake was pacing, as he likes to do, in the parking lot. And I went out there to talk to him, and I said, "Blake, it's going to be okay, and everything's going to be fine." And he was like, "I'm just all upset because he moved positions." And he looked at me and he said, "Mom, I don't want to talk to you about this. If I had an older brother, I would talk to him, but I don't want to talk to you." Wow. So at that point, I went into some corner somewhere and cried like a baby. And I couldn't tell him. I was just in such turmoil. And so there was times through high school, with Blake and his different things that he did. And, he's a good basketball player. And then, he quit basketball because his father didn't think he was good enough and all this stuff. And Danny Brewster would come up to me and I didn't know what to do. And I would be thinking, gosh, maybe I should tell him he has a brother. It was it was a very different, that was probably the most difficult thing I had felt, with a tug of not knowing what to do, whether I should find Stephen, whether I should tell Blake, whether and I told Mark about all this, and Mark would say, "Go find Stephen, go find Stephen, go." I didn't know his name was Stephen at the time, but, and I was it was bad.
Well, I mean, the beauty of God takes our mess and turns. I mean, that's part of the show, right? God takes our mess and turns it into His message.
That was a mess.
It was a mess, but I mean, the beautiful part of it is that out of that mess came a very beautiful thing. I mean, at least that's when I'm reading and looking at you now and the relationship you have with your entire family, including the son that you had to give up early on in life.
Yeah.
It's
Hmm.
amazing. So maybe now that we kind of climaxed to where it was before you decided to go out and reach out to him, what I thought was really cool too was that the whole time in your life, he was really not far from you. He was
No,
always close by, and like the God had kind of kept him really. He kept him in your life, even though you weren't
I didn't
his
know it.
you weren't
Yes.
raising him. You didn't know, but he was there. And then after you get this little nudge, it's almost like a God wink to go look for him. He'd been looking for you, and then
Hmm.
eventually you guys found each other. So can you talk about what happened when you had that reunion, and like what was the dynamic with your family now that you had with Mark, with your older son you've been talking about, and your firstborn, and that relationship, which is Blake, and now you have Stephen here, and then you have your two daughters. How did all that unfold for your family, and what's happened
Oh
since then?
gosh. Well, I received I received a letter from the Catholic Diocese sometimes in March of 2010, and uh, it was a certified letter. And Mark had been out of town because we have a business in Florida. So I said, "Oh, that must be for Mark." So I didn't open it for like about a week. I didn't. So I said, he came back. I was on my way to get a new vacuum cleaner, and I said, "Oh, this certified letter came in for you. Let me go pick that up." So I was in the car driving, and I looked. It was the weirdest thing. Now, this piece of mail had been sitting in front of me for a week, and I'm thinking it's for Mark. I don't know why I saw it like that at the house, but as I'm driving to the post office, um, I see it's a certified letter for me from the Catholic diocese, and I went, "Whoa, this could be something, you know, from my past." So sure enough, I got to the post office and I opened it up, and it was a letter from the social worker just saying, "We're trying to update our stuff, and could you please call me, Sherry at the Catholic Diocese." So I called her, and that's when she revealed to me that my son was trying to find me. He was 35 years old. He had signed, oh, what is it called when you sign something in the law book about searching for a parent? It was something, and it's off the top of my head. I can't remember exactly, but he had signed a registry trying to see if I had signed a registry looking for, you know, my adopted son, him looking for his adopted mother. The Catholic diocese back then closed everything. Everything was closed. So you couldn't find people back then. It was like they just started to let adopted children or adopted or birth mothers look into finding their children. But before, for many, many years, until really 2010, Stephen had gone to I guess it was like a group therapy for adopted children. And they told him to go up there and demand to, try to find your birth mother or father. And so he did that.
And
And
I'm clarifying because you and I now live in the Diocese of Lafayette, but at the time when you had him, you were in the Diocese of Baton Rouge,
right.
correct? So he'd had to go to Baton Rouge and to go to the
He lived
chancery
in
at the
Baton
Baton Rouge. He
Rouge.
lived in Baton Rouge. He'd have to
Yeah,
go there and acquire the information in Baton Rouge.
right. And I'm
Okay.
from Baton Rouge, and we both lived in Baton Rouge, very close to each other. Actually, my um, brother-in-law's children babysat him. That's how close. So, but we never knew that.
Until after you had met with him?
Right, until after. Yeah, they lived in
Wow.
the same area, and my brother-in-law's girls had babysat for him. So yeah, a lot of stuff. I have lots of information, but anyway, he found me, and so she told me. She said he wants to meet you. How do you feel about that? And I said, well, yes, right off the bat. And I was like, yes. I was excited. I was nervous, and I was just ready. I was ready. I think after Blake had done that, um, I was so this was 2 years after that because Blake was in college when he did meet Stephen. I think I was like, okay, if something happens, I got to find him. If not for me, but for Blake, So Sharon told me, well, I have to do at least 6 weeks of therapy with you and then with Stephen before y'all meet. So I would go up to meet her and have a session with her every week for 6 weeks until we met on April 16th.
And I remember
And
reading in the article, you guys met on a bench, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Y'all sat down together, or
well, no, we met at the Catholic Life Center.
you met the Life Center? But maybe there was somewhere else in the article where y'all
Yeah,
both sat down on
we
a bench
met.
together. I mean, it's kind of
Yeah,
coming over my head right now. And
yeah.
I think it might have been after the initial meeting, the first
After
initial meeting.
Mitchell, and I went in there very positive, and I said the two things I remember going into that day. I wasn't going to wear anything black because I didn't want it to be a sad, you know,
Sure.
thing, and I was not going to cry. And I was going to be very strong. And, of course, I prayed a lot, a lot, a lot, lot. And I was
Sure.
going to be very strong. And when I walked in that room to meet him, um, it was, the feeling of God coming over you. It's just,
Sure.
we both, I walked, opened the door, and we held hands and we looked at each other and we go, oh my God, we look so much alike. And which we do. He looks more like me than my other children. And I sat down with him in front of the counselor and I talked and I told him, how much I loved him and how, the different things. And he was a very well dressed, very well mannered guy. And in the letter that he wrote a letter to Mike because he actually thought that his father must have been a damn good athlete because he was a good athlete and he good soccer player and they actually won the state tournament. He played with Kevin Falk. He
Okay.
was the kicker for Catholic High. I had asked his parents when I wrote a little letter before Mike and I wrote a little letter to the adopted parents, please put him in a Catholic school and let him know that he is at least half Italian. I'm full-blooded Italian. So, those little things were important. And so she did that. And through the years, he went through Catholic school and he was a great athlete. And I told him, no, that comes from me. And so he wrote this beautiful letter, just wanting to know where, he came from and different stuff. And he had graduated from LSU in biochemistry and wanted to be a doctor. So,
Oh,
I was a nurse. And so we a lot of the same stuff there. Everything about him and me, um, he does more of the stuff that I do and is more like me than my other children. It is quite incredible, quite remarkable. So we sat there and we talked, and then we went to eat lunch at a little pizza place, and it was just an instant connection, and we both could tell each other we loved each other right then and there. It was just just as Father Collins had told me it would be a blessing beyond, in divine intervention.
mention.
And then I went on to shortly after that, I met his adopted parents who had been divorced, and he had a stepmom too. They were very, very nice. His father had Parkinson's at the time, but he was in a place that he could still communicate. And his mother and his stepmother and his sister that he lived with that was adopted. And then he met my children, and I think you had asked me how I told my children. And
And I'm kind of wondering now too, since you talked about that moment in the football game or after the football game where Blake said, "If I had a big brother, I'd have told my big brother."
uh,
What kind of relationship did they have? What kind of relationship did they have?
now,
now.
Yeah,
Yes.
they do. They're different. Blake has always been quiet and a little bit more reserved. And Blake did go to college, but he didn't finish, and he's now in commercial real estate and doing very well, and has his own way of doing. He's still a bit reserved, but he's very he looks at Stephen and is happy that he does have an older brother, and they do get together. They had gone like to Budapest on a trip, and they see each other, like we'll have family dinners and that kind of stuff. I wouldn't say they mingle in the sense of going out with his friends and Blake's friends. They're just different ages, and Stephen is more a bit more outgoing than Blake. And Stephen's married, and we have a beautiful little grandson that's 3. I think you might see him on the commercial sometimes.
I do.
But and Blake is very close to him. And I would say Hannah is probably the closest to Stephen. Hannah and Stephen are, Hannah's a lot like me, and Stephen's a lot like me. Blake is a bit more like his father. So I would have to say Hannah and Stephen are more, they're the closest.
Your 2 daughters have a good relationship with him.
Yes, yes. They
Yes.
all really do. It's just it's just
Different
different.
ways.
Yeah. And Blake was the hardest to get to know for Stephen. He was the hardest to get to know.
Mm.
Blake was angry with me because I didn't tell him before. He didn't quite understand. He still doesn't quite understand because he's not married and he doesn't have a child.
I
So
get
he
it.
doesn't understand what all that entails. And he thinks that I should have, as soon as Blake was born, I should have had Stephen in his life, but that didn't quite work that way. So, like I said, I never knew what to do with
Mm.
Blake. It was just a different. It was tough.
It's a tough situation to be in, and I think one day once the Lord blesses him with a wife and
Yeah,
kids, he'll
yeah.
have a different take on it once he has a child himself.
Mhm,
I just think that's
mhm.
something that you
Well,
really can't
that's just
fathom until you
no.
have a kid. It's just
You
not.
can't. You
No.
can't. So that was a little tough, and but we go on vacations, we ski together. Stephen now is into tennis. Blake is a big golfer. I mean, there's just a lot of things. And Stephen, gosh, I just got so close to Stephen pretty quickly. I got close to his family quickly. I was there when his father passed away. Stephen was at work in California, and he had Parkinson's and was in a nursing home, and I was there. And then his mother died of a heart attack unexpectedly.
Oh, wow.
And now I'm, his mom, and he does have a stepmom as well. And so Stephen, he calls me for probably every little thing. He wants advice on everything. He's very methodical. He's a bit of a hypochondriac, but I gotta get in there. But he is. We're just very close. He did end up moving to Lafayette. Got married 4 years ago and moved to Lafayette. And I have to say, we see each other 2 or 3 times a week, and the grandbaby 2 or 3 times a week, and so everything is good.
No,
We
it's
got
it's
plenty.
beautiful. You have
Yeah.
a beautiful blended family.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
guess to kind of close it up, I know that this whole process from start to finish, the time you got pregnant, you make this selfless decision to bring this child into the world, and to make another selfless decision to give them up for their benefit over your own, and the
Mhm.
Lord rewards you. It says in 1 John 4:8, "Whoever is without love does not know God, for God is love." So I always ask people that I do an interview with on this program, sometimes the cross teaches us to love in a much different way than we'd ever would have loved if we had not had it in our life.
Right.
So how is that cross and now this resurrection, this reunion is a resurrection, this relationship is a resurrection of that difficulty that was embraced, and now God has given new life to so many people through it. How has it transformed the way that you love and the way you choose to love other people?
Well, I love people without judgment. I'm a very forgiving person. I don't like to hold grudges. I don't think that in this world, which is crazy, especially during this time, that putting more negativity and um, not having God in your life is just not a path I want to go down. So I pretty much think positive. I love my faith. I do what I can. My husband tells me I'm so Catholic, but I'm really not so Catholic like I need to be. And my next journey is to get him to, kind of come around with his religious beliefs. And you know, I try to I try actions instead of words, especially for my children. I would say Hannah still practices, but Carly and Blake, not as much. Stephen, what happened with Stephen was after he graduated from Catholic High, he stopped going to church, stopped going to confession, stopped all that. And then after he met me when he was 35, he started back going to church and confession and doing, being a Catholic.
And I think,
So,
that's I work in parish ministry with Parish School of Religion. I'm the
hmm
director of catechetics for the diocese, and that's part of my job now. And this is a common theme over the last 30 or 40 years. There's been challenges within families keeping kids Catholic and just trying to help them
hmm
move from one step to the next. And sometimes within marriages. And, I'm just thinking back of some of the great saints like St. Monica, who prayed so hard
yeah,
for the conversion of her son, Augustine. But she also, this is a very little known fact by some people that know the story, she also prayed very hard for her husband, who was
hmm
a very, very, he had multiple infidelities. He wasn't a model person at all, but he had a conversion on his deathbed.
hmm
So through her prayers. So I would encourage you to continue to do those things and to keep praying for your kids and challenge your husband to go deeper into
hmm
the faith. And it may speak to your son Blake, who is maybe not so involved right now, because there's more rejoicing in heaven over one lost sheep that comes back than the
yeah.
99 who are
Oh,
are in the fold.
absolutely.
So
Absolutely. That's why
and
I
I
pray for
think,
the perfect wife to come into his path. Perfect woman that can help me help him.
if you pray for that, I do. I truly believe that will happen, and I think
Uh-huh.
that your selfless decision has definitely reaped a reward in your life and brought a lot of grace there. And it's been really great having you today on the show. Thank you for coming here today, for your humility, because it takes a lot of humility to share what happens in our life with other people, and a lot of vulnerability, and
hmm
you sharing that suffering and how you've allowed Christ to work in it for your own benefit, but most importantly, as I can see throughout the way you share the story, for the benefit of other people. If you enjoyed this podcast, give it a rating, leave a comment. If you'd like to invite me to speak at an event or pick up a copy of any of my books, shoot me a message on social media or go to my website, chadjadis.com. All proceeds from my writing and speaking go to funds Eli's lifelong medical expenses. Remember, we must boast most gladly in our weaknesses, so that the strength of Christ might be with us. When we're weak, that's when we're strong. And it takes a Good Friday to leave behind who the world says we should be, in order to rise with Jesus Christ on Easter Sunday as the person he created us to be, a saint. Until next time, God love you.
In a world that says give up, I did not yield. I gave my all for your battlefield.